People are really starting to ask, how will the end of the Ukraine war redraw the map of Ukraine, even the map of Europe? What will be the final outcome? And does any of the states involved, Russia, EU, the United States, or even Ukraine itself, have a clear plan for what the future map, territories or states of Ukraine will be? And in this video, I want to draw your attention to a very intriguing intervention by Alexei Arestovych, the former advisor to President Zelensky, a Ukrainian, who has set out in a recent video his idea that there will be 3 Ukraines at the end of this war. Let's have a look at it and how it will redraw the map of Europe. So as I said, Alexei Arestovych, who is a former advisor to President Zelensky, his former spin doctor, who worked for him both before and during the early period of the current war, current phase of the war, has made a recent video as part of a weekly stream he does that is censored, I guess, in Ukraine, but nonetheless gets through to many, many people in Ukraine. He's done a recent video on, has Russia decided on the end of war plan for Ukraine? What is Russia's actual objectives in terms of which territories, which oblasts or regions of Ukraine will it finally control at the end of the war? Does it have a vision for the post-war settlement? And what will the boundaries of a post-war Ukraine be? He offers a very interesting perspective. Although he used to work for President Zelensky, he has fallen out of favour. He is de facto in exile in a summer country, which is undisclosed, yet he is also a candidate for president in Ukraine. Of course, no elections are being held in Ukraine at the moment. He has become a fierce critic of the way both Ukraine and the NATO countries are conducting the war, and yet also is critical of Russia and advocates a rather interesting perspective for how the war should end. And in this video, he is perhaps more open, explicit, in a way more, he sets out his general ideas about that more clearly than in any other video that I have seen. So it is really worth paying attention to. He sets out his view that he says he hasn't switched sides in this war. He has always seen what he describes as a meta-civilization of Rus, RUS, being formed by the 3 brotherly nations of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, or at least European Russia. I'm not sure he feels so brotherly towards Eurasian Russia. And he sees the war as a tragedy of the conflict between these 3 related brotherly nations, these 3 members of what he describes as a meta-civilization, who are not able to realize their potential because they have been diverted by fratricidal conflicts which have been exploited by most particularly the United States and the West, and diverted from their fundamental kinship by the extreme ethno-nationalist ideologies in Ukraine. He has become a fierce critic of the extreme ethno-nationalism of the Zelensky government, of the Azov brigades, and all the rest of it. The kind of ideologies that I discussed in my interview with Ukrainian historian Marta Havrishko, and there's a link to that video in the video description below. So he has this idea that ultimately there is a possibility for some sort of reconciliation between these three brotherly nations of Ukraine, not so different to the rhetoric of President Vladimir Putin before the war, which Western critics were highly critical of, but which Alexei Arestovych in many ways shares a common or at least related vision of. And what he says is that as this war is approaching its end, the Russian side, the Russian diplomats and senior political people have studied very closely what happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Yugoslavia, the country of the southern Slavs. Yugo means southern in Slavic languages. The country of the southern Slavs that dissolved in disastrous conflicts, partly instigated and driven by NATO, it must be said, in the early 1990s. Most infamously, of course, this involved, events like the Srebrenica massacre, but it also involved NATO's bombing of Serbia in the 1990s. And what was one relatively successful almost third way socialist state in the post-war period became a scene of deep conflict and divided into quite a few states with different ethnic, cultural and political loyalties, which were like Bosnia and Serbia and Montenegro and Kosovo, most notoriously Kosovo, because Kosovo was formed separately from Serbia through an act of declaration of national self-determination, which was justified by the international courts and which has provided a precedent indeed for the actions of the Donetsk and Lugansk republics from 2014, self-determined, self-declared nationalist republics sent between 2014 and 2022, and became, if you like, the basis of the intervention of Russia into Ukraine in 2022. So it's a very vexed area of law, but it's also a case, I guess, of a modern partition of a state, like the late 18th century partition of Poland by Russia, Austria, and Prussia, the major German state of that era. Alexei Arestovych says that he both believes that Russia has a plan, and he also largely thinks this may well be a feasible and viable plan for the future as well, from his perspective, a plan that could actually see the three brotherly nations of Belarus, Russia and Ukraine live together in some kind of harmonious coexistence. He sees this plan as Ukraine forming into three states. Now, the three states are basically eastern Ukraine, including which would go into the Russian Federation, including the various parts of the Russian Federation that have already been incorporated into Russia. Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, but potentially other oblasts or regions, provinces of Ukraine, including Kharkiv and Sumy, and others, perhaps most controversially, even the Odessa region. So that's the first part of the partition, if you like, of Ukraine. The second part would be the formation of a relatively small statelet in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the area formerly controlled by Poland, Lithuania, and formerly controlled by the Austrian Empire, formerly controlled indeed by the German Empire of the 1930s and 1940s. That is Galicia, or you could call it Podolia, even Western Ukraine, if you like. Now, this is the territory that Alexei Arestovych believes the current a strongly ethno-nationalist, very pro-Western, pro-NATO wing of Ukrainian society would withdraw into and be encouraged to withdraw into by the victor in the war, by the Russian Federation. He basically also describes this area as the insurgent Ukrainian army dugout. He envisages it as essentially a rump Ukraine in which the pro-NATO forces, which the Russian government currently describes as a terrorist organisation, would retreat into and be contained within. Lviv, the western part of Ukraine, has been the home base of this extreme ethno-nationalism in Ukraine, as described in my interview with Marta Averishko. Over the last decade or more, it has spread eastward into the wider Ukraine and destroyed the prospects of a united, federated Ukraine. And effectively, Arestovych both supports the idea and suggests that Russia has the idea that those elements of Ukrainian society should be contained in a small, landlocked territory close to the border of Poland and be subject to, I guess, the discipline of not wanting to infringe upon what would be the major part of remaining Ukraine, which is neutral Ukraine. Neutral Ukraine is central Ukraine. It's the territory of Kiev and potentially the territory all the way down to the Black Sea, including Odessa. The exact boundaries between eastern Ukraine and western Ukraine, or Galicia or Podolia, you could even call it, with historical precedent. That territory is, not the boundaries of that would be subject to the outcomes of the war and the determinations of the negotiations. But they are the three territories. And the thing about this central territory of Ukraine, which I think in the video Alexei Arestovych even describes with historical reference as Kievan Rus. It's broadly similar to the actual historic territories of Kievan Rus back in, between the sort of roughly 800 to 1200 period. Then that part of Ukraine would be neutral Ukraine. It would be committed to neutrality, and all the people of Ukraine who do not support the extreme ethno-nationalists, who do not want to be part of, I guess, Russia or Eastern Ukraine, but want to see a Ukraine as it used to be, a neutral state, a more federal, multilingual, multicultural state within the broad cultural Russian world, within what Alexei Arestovych describes as the meta-civilization of Rus. That would be, I guess, the new home for those people. The security of neutral Ukraine, in Alexei Arestovych's view, would be guaranteed by Russia. So there we see three quite interesting proposal, effectively, of a partition of Ukraine into, I guess, a pro-NATO, ultra-nationalist, but probably unviable statelet in the far west of the country, a large territory of eastern Ukraine that potentially could also extend to southeastern Ukraine, to include Odessa and the Nikolaev region, and a central neutral Ukraine based, if you like, on the historical territories of Kievan Rus, which by choosing neutrality and by choosing its coexistence within the cultural world of what Alexei Arestovych describes as the meta-civilization of Rus, choosing basically a path for peace and security that would follow this war. That is, he says, where he would go. That is where he feels he could return to. Not the Ukraine that used to be, but the Ukraine that perhaps the ethno-nationalist world destroyed and turned its back on. It's a very interesting idea, and I just want to bring out a couple of other features of it, partly to emphasise that this may well be the way in which the end of the Ukraine war is settled, not a division of Ukraine into two parts, but a division of Ukraine into three parts. And there's some interesting additional observations that Alexei Arestovych makes. He picks up on the issue I recently discussed in an interview with Jamal Thomas on Jamal Thomas's excellent live stream and video YouTube channel about the statements by Russian political and legal figures that the legality of the Ukrainian state in all the decisions of the Ukrainian state are in question because of the nature of the process of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In brief, it was not done in accordance with the Soviet constitution. It was done in a hurried way, in defiance of a constitutional vote, in defiance of the constitution, without the participation of all the states of the Soviet Union. It was basically a unilateral act by Ukraine, Russia and Belarus, which was not in conformance with the law that then applied. So arguably, and this is the point Alexei Arestovych makes, all the decisions of the Ukraine state since 1991 could be considered to be made illegally and invalid. So not that they'd sort of relitigate all those decisions, but it is important when one thinks about reconstituting both an eastern Ukraine and a central or neutral Ukraine, a Kievan Rus, that is no longer constrained by legal agreements made with NATO, with the United States, with MI6, or with BlackRock. There would be a capacity, if you like, for neutral Ukraine to rebuild itself within the legal, cultural, political framework of what Alexei Arestovych describes as meta-civilizational Rus. The other thing he emphasizes is the likelihood of movements of people, that Russia would be more than happy to help move the extreme nationalists into the sort of rump state of Western Ukraine, and that many of the refugee Ukrainians in Europe, even potentially in Russia these days, would be happy to return potentially, not to that rump state that has set Ukraine on this disastrous course, but to the more viable neutral state of central Ukraine, of Kievan Rus. The third sort of point I'd like to make about this potentially redrawn map of Ukraine is that, of course, the exact boundaries of this could be quite different. And this is clearly going to be determined to some degree by the political and military outcomes at the moment of negotiations. But it's not just a question of drawing a line on the map. The boundaries here also need to pay attention to the linguistic cultural, social, all those characteristics of the Ukrainian society that lives on those maps, or that could live on those maps, but also the actual physical geography of Ukraine. So it's worth having a quick look at the actual maps of Ukraine here to think about how potentially this issue could be solved without arbitrary lines being drawn by American officials or American geostrategic analysts. And so if we first look at the political sort of map of Ukraine, this map shows the various oblast regions, provinces of Ukraine, the current regions that are claimed by Russia, and also the area in which there is significant fighting and advance at the moment. So, for example, there has been significant talk about a buffer zone being established in Sumy and in Kharkiv region, or Kharkov region, it may be called, following the end of the war. Similarly, there is a lot of question about Odessa and Nikolaev region, and indeed over Dnipro and the central oblasts around Dnipro or Dnipropetrovsk. So these maps could well be drawn differently. And the other point is on the far west of Ukraine. There are significant claims from Hungary, Romania, Poland, Slovakia over some of the peoples, as in the cultural and social and other affiliations of the people of Western Ukraine. Significant numbers of Hungarians. There are places where Hungarian is spoken, not Ukrainian. And it may well be that, and the current lines of Ukraine were really redrawn after 1945. It may well be that some of those states wish to more properly integrate their peoples into their own states at the end of this war. And there's a further dimension of this that becomes even more intriguing when you actually look not at a political map of Ukraine, not at a military map of Ukraine, but at a sort of a geographical map of Ukraine, one that highlights the various river basins of Ukraine, the major, if you like, the real geography of Ukraine, the actual, Ukraine is part of the Eurasian steppe. There are, significant natural boundaries and defences defined by the rivers, particularly the vast, enormous Dnieper River, which is at points an extremely broad river. It's the river that historically was the river that the Northern Rus came down from the area near Novgorod to settle or to claim the lands of Kiev for the Rus. It was the big trade route with the Tatars and the Pechenegs and the others who lived near the Black Sea. And this map just helps us also visualise perhaps what also the physical realities of a kind of partition of Ukraine may well be. So if we look at the far west of Ukraine first, we can highlight a couple of these areas that I mentioned before that do have strong connections with neighbouring countries, with Romania, with Hungary, and with Moldova, and did I say Romania as well, and with Poland. The area that is, I guess, closest to Poland is the area around Lviv, very much around the east. But to the south of that, you have these areas which are both culturally and historically and politically, I guess, connected, people-to-people relationships connected to Hungary, Romania and Slovakia and Moldova, there is also a physical reality there. There is actually a sort of river basin contrast. And then we also, one of the other great rivers of Ukraine is the Dniester, and the area known as Transnistria, which you can see here, is also a real river basin. And this is the area which has dual loyalties to Russia and Moldova and Ukraine, that there is significant argument and debate within that society about whether it should be pro-NATO, pro-European Union, or pro-Russia. So one can also easily see that area perhaps being sent more into neutral Ukraine, or potentially even being incorporated in a different way into an ultimate political settlement. Clearly, also, there is the enormous physical barrier of the Dnieper River, and there has been a lot of speculation. The Russian forces will ultimately want to go all the way to the Dnieper River, which includes a number of these other provinces that you can see there. And then the last thing I'd like to point out is just this big central northern river basin of Ukraine. There are really no natural barriers in this basin. It doesn't just border on Poland and, if you like, pro-EU Europe. It also borders to the north on Belarus. Now, Belarus is a union state of Russia, and one would imagine that if there is a political settlement, a partition, if you like, of Ukraine, a division of current Ukraine into three Ukraines, east, west, and neutral, then the neutral state will need to have a clearly defined relationship with Belarus as well. So one can see there that it's probably the Western Ukraine is going to be a very small state indeed. I guess the other big question is what will happen to Odessa and those regions in the south of Ukraine, and that will ultimately, I guess, be a question maybe for those people themselves through some kind of a referendum and national self-determination choice, as well as a result of the political settlement. I'm not sure the fate of Odessa will be determined by military results. I think it will probably be determined by political and diplomatic negotiation following a certain level of military defeat and acceptance of defeat by Ukraine, Britain, EU, and the United States of America. So I hope you found this video interesting. I am thinking of doing some more regular videos updating on the Russia-Ukraine-NATO war, especially now that we're moving more clearly away from a purely military conflict towards both a military process and a diplomatic process. And I think there's perhaps more scope for me to comment in ways that are not already well covered by many of the military-focused analysts on the war, to comment on how this war ultimately will lead to a significant redrawing of security arrangements, not just in Europe, but I think across Eurasia, across the world, really, because America's partition of Eurasia since 1945 has effectively, helped define this constant conflict between, I guess, the meta-civilization of Rus, to use Alexei Arestovych's term, and the civilization of Europe. It's not quite how I see this situation. But also it has defined the military presence of the United States of America in the Western Pacific and Eastern Asia, indeed even in Central and South Central and Western Asia as well. But I do feel now that we are clearly pursuing a diplomatic course, even though there might be some ups and downs along that way, I may well provide more regular updates on this video to explore how things are developing and how we can think about them more intelligently if we look at the broader sweep of world history, as I do at my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. Why don't you go over there and sign up to my World History World Tour and learn from history and explore with me this year the 5 big civilization state great powers of the world: United States, Europe, India, China, and Russia. Hope to see you in the next video soon.